Revolution began in 1775 and continued for 8 bloody years as America fought for independence. Throughout that period, African Americans fought with valor and courage, showing they would do whatever it took to acquire the deserved freedom and equality. An important African American hero was James Armistead Lafayette, who was the first African American double agent. Born into slavery to owner William Armistead around December 10th, 1748, his future looked grim. Would not be so. With his master's permission, volunteered to join the U.S. Army in order to fight for the American Revolution, was soon stationed under Marquis de Lafayette, commander of the Allied French forces. The general employed Armistead as a spy, with the hopes Armistead would be able to gather intelligence on enemy movements. Armistead did much more than that. Posed as a runaway slave, convinced Benedict Arnold to hire him to spy on the Americans. Furthermore, using the details of Armistead's reports, General Lafayette and George Washington were able to prevent British from sending reinforcements to Yorktown. The blockade surprised British forces, and the Americans were able to force the British to surrender in Yorktown. Despite Armistead's heroic actions, Armistead had to return to his master and his life as a slave. Armistead decided to petition the Virginia government for his emancipation. The General Marquis de Lafayette assisted Armistead by writing a recommendation for his freedom, which was granted in 1787. Armistead then adopted Lafayette's surname and used it for the rest of his life. After acquiring his freedom, he bought 40 acres of land and started farming. He married, raised a family, and received $40 annually from Virginia for his services in the war. Without a doubt, Armistead was a hero, but he risked his life time and time again for the war effort and gathered important information. Like other black soldiers, he demonstrated his courage and intelligence, which would cause some whites to question certain common held beliefs.
Almost 29 years later, the newly formed United States and Britain were at war for the second time. Dubbed the Second War of Independence, the War of 1812 was primarily fought for the freedom of the seas, though some land battles did occur. Like the Revolution, blacks were called on to fill the swindling ranks of the U.S. Unlike the previous war, the Navy did not exclude them from joining. The Army and Marines were the only branches that did not allow colored soldiers within its ranks. This later changed with the Army when it could not muster enough white men to fight the British on land. Andrew Jackson recruited slaves from plantations to serve in the defense of New Orleans. Though promised their freedom, many never saw it, but most did receive equal pay as their white counterparts. After the battle, Jackson highly commended them for their bravery in action. Vice Admiral Sir Alexander Cochrane quoted, "Extraordinary steadiness and good conduct when in action with the enemy," when referring to the black soldiers and sailors he encountered. Most African American enlistment resided with the Navy. In 1813, 10 to 20% of all Navy crews were colored. All of them were volunteers. Abolitionist Martin Delany said African Americans were willing and ready to fight. He was quoted, "They were not compelled to go, they were not drafted, they were volunteers." White commanders also praised their dedication. Naval Lieutenant Isaac Chauncey said that the 50 black sailors on his ship were among his best men. One famous black sailor was Cyrus Tiffany, who used his body to shield his commanding officer, Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry, from incoming artillery. Perry later changed his views on African Americans after the battle, and held a high respect for those who served in the military. Though many African Americans served in the War of 1812, their true test would come years later in the Civil War, where the chance at freedom would become reality.
Like the American Revolution and the War of 1812, African Americans fought in the American Civil War. The Civil War began because of disagreements between the northern and southern states. These disagreements focused mainly on the topic of slavery and state rights. 7 slave states had seceded from the Union, with several more leaving after further problems between the North and the South. The war officially began when the seceded southern states, known as the Confederacy, attacked Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861. This marked the beginning of a brutal and savage war in which many people on both sides lost their lives. During the period of the Civil War, many men fought and died for their country. Whether it was for the North or the South, each believed their way of life would be what would shape the future of America. The war was not fought only by white men. African Americans soon became a part of both sides' armies, although the North was strongly in the majority. They saw this war as not only an opportunity to possibly gain control over their lives and freedom, but to prove that they were truly human beings who deserved to live in this country freely and influence future aspects of America. Even near the beginning of the war, they were initially denied to become soldiers in the North. Abraham Lincoln had called for volunteers, and African Americans were eager to answer this call, but it was not for a couple more years before African Americans were allowed to fight in the war by joining the Massachusetts African American Regiment. Many African Americans were eager to become a part of this new regiment and fought to prove that they had as much of a stake in this country as white men did. But even before they were allowed to fight, the cause proving African Americans were more than willing and able was already underway. Throughout the Civil War, there were many examples of African Americans who fought for their side and proved to the country that they had earned their place in the annals of history. But one of the more famous examples is of the slave-turned-Congressman Robert Smalls. It's because of Smalls' efforts in his escape from the South that helps convince the North to enlist black soldiers. Smalls, along with a few other slaves, was serving on the CSS Planter, a Confederacy ship that was currently docked at the Charleston harbor. After the white crew members disembarked from the ship for the night, in the early morning was when Smalls and the other ship slaves made their escape. Due to his experience on the ship, he knew what he was doing and what steps he would have to take to escape Confederate territory undetected. He wore the hat of a white captain and had the Confederate flag risen on board. As they made their way through, they stopped by a dock and picked up Small's family and some other slaves on board and set sail again. On the way out, the planter had to send signals to forts that were guarding the way out of the harbor. Using his knowledge of the various signals he had learned while serving on board, he fooled the forts into letting them pass. Once through, they made their way through to the Union's naval blockade, where when they were out of range of the Southern guns, they lowered the Confederate flag and raised the white flag, signifying that they were giving up. However, members of the Union blockade were shocked to see contraband on the ship and the fact they had slipped right under the nose of the Confederacy. On board the planter were invaluable items such as weapons, ammunition, and Smalls' knowledge of secret Confederacy information. For this act, Robert Smalls and his family were granted their freedom and given a small payment of the total value of the ship. Soon after, Smalls began to advocate the enlistment of black soldiers in the Northern Army, and with the service he provided, helped convince Lincoln to do so. He helped recruit many black soldiers himself, and even got to serve aboard the planter, the same ship he had turned over to the Union. He even became the first black captain when the planter's white captain became demoralized during a battle. After the war, he eventually purchased the house that belonged to his former master, and was even a politician for several years. What Smalls accomplished proved that the African Americans were willing to risk everything for a cause, and could be relied upon because they were just as American as any white man.
By 1898, in the outbreak of the Spanish-American War, there were 4 black regiments in the U.S. Army. These included the 9th and 10th Cavalry and the 24th and 25th Infantry. These 4 regiments were segregated, but also were under the command of white officers. These 4 regiments were assigned mainly to the west to deal with Indian troubles, but when war broke out with Spain, they were quickly moved to the front lines to aid in the fight. They served valiantly at several battles, including the famous charge of San Juan Hill. Many of these regular soldiers earned the Medal of Honor, including Dennis Bell, who aided in the rescue of several fellow soldiers. Many more African Americans served the war effort in volunteer regiments, but these units rarely saw combat and were mainly used for support roles. Nevertheless, many blacks volunteered their services for the protection of the country. African Americans fought hard and well during the Spanish-American War, but their contributions were soon forgotten as white politicians and military commanders sought to play down their roles in the war. Teddy Roosevelt was initially very thankful for the efforts of the black soldiers. I don't think that any Rough Rider will ever forget the tie that binds us to the 9th and 10th Cavalry. It wasn't because the colored troopers were colored that we admired them, it was because they were brave and worthy of respect. These sentiments were soon lost, though, when Roosevelt ran for office. He tried to distance himself from the African American cause for equal rights, even after witnessing firsthand their bravery and skill. All told, African Americans were important to the American military and helped it to become what it is today. Unfortunately, they would not receive the recognition they so deserved until many years later. But we should not forget all that they did to help our nation become what it is today.